Reinhard Heydrich, as I say, one of the most evil individuals in Nazi Germany. He, of course, doesn't make it far beyond 1942. He was appointed as governor of Czechoslovakia. He proceeds to hang thousands of Czechs. The British decide to assassinate Heydrich. They drop SOE, SEOs, or special executive. I forgot now what it stood for, but it's kind of their assassination, and SOE, special something executive. They drop their. These are assassins and saboteurs working for British Special Operations Executive (SOE). They are saboteurs and assassins working for British intelligence. They notice that Heydrich likes to travel in an open limousine, often without an escort. And they notice that he often takes the same route, that he travels past these corners, and that when he passes this corner, there's a very tight hairpin turn here, and that the car slows by. And so they await Heydrich in the spring of 42. And as he passes by, they first attempt to assassinate him with machine gun fire, but the machine gun jams, and then another assassin tosses a grenade, which misses Heydrich at first, and then rolls underneath. It hits the hood of his car, and then rolls underneath the car, and then detonates on the other side of the car. And this now injures Heydrich, who's standing. His driver, rather than driving away, stops, and Heydrich pulls out his handgun and tries to shoot the assassins. And of course, instead, he becomes just an extra target. And so Heydrich is wounded, and he will eventually die of an infection from his wounds. And that's the end of Heydrich. There's a massive funeral, and the Germans will destroy a village, Lidz in Czechoslovakia, that had some remote connection to one of the people involved in the assassination of Heydrich. He's now replaced by Ernst Kaltenbrunner. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, on those IQ tests, scores as one of the lowest. I think his intelligence is just slightly marginally above Streicher's intelligence. He ends up, of course, in the Nuremberg dock, because he takes over Heydrich's job as the head of the RSHA, even though he's not really there for designing all the Holocaust plans. He certainly is part of the system, and so he ends up in the dock, Kaltenbrunner, although he's very ill by then, standing in for where Heydrich should have sat. He'll be hung. Himmler escapes, traveling in the company of these two guys. But again, Himmler is captured, attempting to escape. When they search him, they find this capsule in his pocket that they know used to contain cyanide. When they begin to search him, they bring this big light up to look inside his mouth. And at this point, Himmler must have been hiding the capsule in his mouth, and so he bites down the capsule and drops dead on the floor from cyanide poisoning. Um, this, of course, starts this mythology that Himmler and senior Nazis had special hollow teeth which contain cyanide capsules, and if you bite down in a particular way on the tooth, you release the cyanide. I think it's kind of doesn't quite explain how you can eat, steak, or if you grind your teeth at night, you want to walk around with a cyanide capsule that all you need to do is bite bite down on in your mouth, I think it's nonsense. It clearly he was just hiding the capsule in his teeth. But you might remember video footage when Saddam Hussein was captured. As soon as they pull him out of that hole he was hiding in, there's a dentist who is looking inside Saddam Hussein's mouth. It's not that they're worried whether Saddam Hussein had um, cavities or not. They're looking if Saddam Hussein, who was a big um, admirer of the Nazis, whether Saddam Hussein believed this myth of cyanide capsules built in one's tooth and built one for had one built for himself. That's why they kind of jump right away looking inside Saddam Hussein's mouth. But I think it's a mythology, it's a myth. No one has ever been able to give me evidence that these kind of capsules actually existed inserted into a Nazi's tooth. But if you find evidence for that, definitely please get in touch with me and send it on to me. So that's the end of Himmler. He too escapes the dock. Himmler is then buried. Here's the burial party, literally the burial party. As you can see, they have glasses of wine in their hands. These British soldiers are the only ones who know where Himmler's body is secretly buried in a forest. And they returned there around 1970-71 for this series of photographs, again taken secretly, where they buried Himmler, and then they subsequently died. And so Himmler's body is lost to history. The fear, of course, was that people would make it into some kind of shrine for neo-Nazis. Goering and Frick, they survive, as do Streicher and Hess here and Rosenberg. So some of the old school Nazis do survive. Goering is captured alive. He will be sentenced to death, and I've already talked about the fate of Goering and his suicide, his trial. So you can see the admirals, for example, Donitz, who was in charge of the submarines, he gets 10 years, which he serves and then is released. Admiral Radar, the head of the German Navy, gets a life term. He serves it out. Von Schirach was involved with the Hitler Youth, 20 years. Slave labor master Sauckel hangs. Yodo, head of the German High Command, hung. Von Papen is acquitted. Sess Inquart, the governor of the Netherlands, hung. Speer, Hitler's architect and his minister of munitions, 20 years. Von Neurath, 15 years. Fritzsche, a radio propagandist, acquitted. Schacht, acquitted. Funk, the Reichsbank president, Ministry of Economics, life. Streicher hangs, Frick hangs, Frank hangs, Rosenberg hangs, Kaltenbrunner hangs, Keitel, also a German general in the High Command, hangs, Ribbentrop hangs, and Goering is to hang, but of course he commits suicide. And of course, again, I discussed how these trials lead to these charges, including the evolution of crimes against humanity or genocide. Many of the war criminals will escape. And how that happens partly has to do with U.S. intelligence and the role that Alan Welsh Dulles, who's going to be the head of U.S. intelligence operations in Switzerland during the Second World War, and in fact, operating all these intelligence operations will have. Alan Welsh Dulles, of course, will run American intelligence throughout Europe, based in Switzerland. And of course, Afterwards, he will become the director of the Central Intelligence Agency from 1953 till 1961, the head of the CIA, until he's fired by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Let me stop here, give you a 5 minute breather, and I'll quickly just go through what happens with some of the prime war criminals who had escaped. And I'll take any questions you might have over the next 5 minutes as well.
Hey, sir, just a quick question. Can we expect to get our essay grades back before the exam?
I can't promise you that. It's taking longer than I thought. So I usually like to return essays by the exam for those people who handed them in on time. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do that. Um, I'm doing my best to get through them all, but I want to put good time in for them. So I'm going to recommend to everybody just assume you did terribly on your essay and put everything you have into the final exam. Just blitz that final exam on the assumption. Don't try to kind of edge and calculate your final mark and I can take a half effort on the final exam. Give it all you got.
Okay, thank you.
But I will try to do that for you guys. Like I said, I just can't promise you. I usually like to do that, but doing these things online it takes so long. Then just quickly marking your essay on paper, putting in my notes in by hand, and just handing it back to you in class was so much easier and smoother. And doing these lectures, I can't understand why it takes so much longer for me to lay out this lecture material. I mean, am I speaking slowly or,
Yeah,
what is it?
no, it's okay. Thank you.
Sir,
Yeah.
would it be possible to give us a sample essay question? Like not one that you're going to use, but just to give us an idea of the essay?
Well, a sample essay question could be, asking you about a particular argument that may have been raised by Richard Bissell about the coming of power in Nazi Germany. The questions will be focused on kind of themes that we covered: race, power, the relationship between the kind of constitutional structure of Weimar Germany and Hitler's ability to subvert the constitution via both kind of constitutional legal measures plus kind of conspiratorial, underhanded measures. The role of the police services, the police state, what does that mean? German foreign policy, diplomacy, the responses from European countries to the rise of Nazis in Europe and Hitler's foreign policy issues. Obviously, the final solution, the Holocaust, racial issues in Nazi Germany. So the questions will be kind of based around these themes that almost every lecture essentially it hits upon, and so I say a combination of things that you should be able to draw on from the lectures and from the essay questions.
Thank you.
So essentially, what you'll see on the exam is you'll pick 3 out of 12 key terms that appear subsequently to the midterm exam, and then you'll pick out of 9 possible essays, you'll pick one, and you'll write a longer essay. The exam is 3 hours, so consider you kind of have roughly a little bit over an hour for each, and then you have an hour to kind of organize your thoughts or edit or whatever you need to do, or an hour and a half for each part. So you're writing one long, detailed essay from which you're reaching out to everything you have, and then you're doing those traditional identify and give significance of key term responses.
I have one question.
Yeah.
Did I understand that you're not going to be asking like in the key terms about like the Blitzkrieg, which is basically like the kind of war, not the war, like all the attacks to all the little countries in Europe, or?
No, I might.
Oh,
That certainly covers everything, since remember we ended at August 34th. So the key terms will begin with those lectures that it started after the midterm, right?
yeah.
Um, you'll have to check. So it could include those things, and certainly everything that was in lecture about Hitler's expansion, say his foreign policy, will be. If you're talking about the lecture today, that you may find some useful context there, but I'm not going to really examine you on anything that um, looks like a key term from today, including the kind of chronology I gave you of the Second World War today as well. I'm not going to examine you on that, right? You know, I would like to give you a little bit more breathing room between my lecture today and um, your exam on Wednesday. But in today's lecture, you may find some things that gives you some perspective or some context for your essay. But I'm not really examining you specifically on today's lecture the way I'm doing for the other lectures.
Okay,
So the
thank you.
recorded lectures are specifically going to be on the exam?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, let me continue. So, Dulles, of course, and his brother John Foster Dulles, who was the U.S. Secretary of State, are lawyers in this key law firms, Sullivan and Cromwell, that are involved in globalizing some of the German companies back in the in the First World War and as well in the 1930s. They're the law firm that handles some of the Dawes money investments. Remember, I had discussed in one of my recorded lectures this kind of interlocking of German companies and as American subsidiaries, how American companies had often shares in these German companies, and how these payments continue to be made through the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland. So a lot of these key SS figures involved in these companies, as the war is beginning to go sour, start contacting Alan Dulles in Switzerland. And one of the most important intelligence operations that Dulles completes during this war is called Operation Sunrise, or also known as the Secret Surrender. This involves a particular high ranking Nazi, Karl Wolff. You might have seen his face in the photographs I've been showing you. Karl Wolff is Himmler's adjutant. And so when I showed you these photographs, there's Karl Wolff right there, standing right behind Hitler and Himmler. He is Himmler's right hand man. He is a former advertising executive. He worked for many of these companies prior to his kind of being mobilized after Hitler takes power in the SS as Himmler's adjutant and right hand man. Karl Wolff is on shaking hands basis with Hitler. He is this kind of high ranking diplomat as well with Himmler. Here he is, Himmler visiting with Franco, the dictator of Spain. Karl Wolff is here with Mussolini. Karl Wolff is here with Sess Inquart and Himmler inspecting the destruction of the Dutch Jews at the hands of Sess Inquart. Karl Wolff is here inspecting all those concentration camps with Himmler. There he is, right there. Karl Wolff goes with Himmler on these field tours he takes of the Einsatzgruppen in the summer of 1941. Here he is with Bach Zalewski, as Karl Wolff is there to witness the shootings and executions and to urge the killers onwards. When Himmler encounters that little blonde boy who's going to be executed, Karl Wolff is right there. Karl Wolff is there on inspections of those POW camps. Karl Wolff is with Heydrich. Karl Wolff is everywhere. Karl Wolff is one of the pallbearers when Heydrich is assassinated. He's up there in the front row with his sword. Karl Wolff ends up the higher SS police, the high SS police commander in northern Italy. And Karl Wolff now realizes that the Nazis are about to lose the war. And so now Karl Wolff, with the power he has, takes a quick trip to Switzerland and meets with Dulles. And he comes to Dulles and says, oh my God, I never knew Hitler was a Nazi. He tricked me, and now I'm going to get hung. What can I do to save my life so you don't hang me? And Alan Dulles tells him, well, Karl, all you have to do is just surrender the German army to us in Italy. And that's what Karl Wolff does. Operation Sunrise is the secret surrender. It has to be secret because it has to be kept secret from the Russians. The Allies had all agreed that they will take no separate negotiated surrender from the Germans. It's all in or nothing. And so there can be no conditional surrenders. But of course, there is a condition with Karl Wolff, is that him and all senior SS commanders under his command in Italy will not be prosecuted. And so Alan Dulles negotiates this secret surrender. It certainly saves thousands of British, American, Canadian, Italian, and German lives by ending the war in Italy about a good 3 weeks earlier than it ended everywhere else. But of course, there are conditions, and the conditions is that nothing happens to Karl Wolff, this notorious murderer, just the right-hand man of Heinrich Himmler, for crying out loud. He is actually superior to Heydrich, and nothing will happen to him. He'll get a denazification fine. I think he serves a short term, like for time served as a POW, and then he ends up spending the rest of his life gardening happily at home. Nothing happens to Karl Wolff, and he'll live until 1984, until he dies of natural causes, completely untouched. And of course, we all suspected that some kind of dirty deal was done. We couldn't quite understand what the deal was until the US Congress in the early 2000s passed a law requiring that the CIA open its archives on Nazi war criminals and whether they were recruited by the CIA, and it turns out they were. And Karl Wolff was one of them. And how Karl Wolff was protected, I I gave you the reference, Conspiracy of Silence. It's an article in 2008 on Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Conspiracy of Silence, how the old boys of American intelligence shielded SS General Karl Wolff from prosecution. We can see this exactly how the mechanism worked, based now on newly declassified documents. As I say, declassified in around 2006, I think, was the congressional act that opened up these files that had been kept secret until then. Now we know the nuts and bolts of how it operated. Zalewski, this hardcore killer, walks away at the end of the war. He too, he turns prosecuting testimony. He is protected again by a cabal of CIA officers, and again, Zalewski ends up free at the end of the war. Walter Rauff, the inventor of the gas trucks, he will be captured by American troops and then will be used as a CIA agent and eventually exfiltrated by the CIA to South America, where he will again live out his life. I think he ends up in Chile, if I'm not mistaken, when Simon Wiesenthal, the war criminal hunter, discovers him in Chile. They attempt to extradite him from Chile. The Chilean, this was still when Allende, a left-wing politician, was in power. The Chilean Supreme Court refuses to release Rauff for extradition back to Germany or to Israel. And Allende says, look, I cannot overrule the Supreme Court. And of course, Allende, very quickly after that, is overthrown. And General Pinochet, of course, isn't going to extradite Rauff either. So he gets away with it. Thousands and thousands of these hardcore killers essentially get away with it. Kurt von Schroeder, the banker, remember, he is back in business banking by the 1950s, as all are the executives of IG Farben who ran those slave camps. SS General Walter Schellenberg, who was the head of the SD Ausland, the Nazi Party's foreign intelligence agency, ends up working as an advisor to the CIA after the war and will retire in Switzerland, completely untouched by any of the crimes that the SD and the SS had committed. General Reinhard Gehlen, the head of German intelligence on the Eastern Front. Reinhard Gehlen is caught by the Americans, and then he's given a whole new identity, Hans Obein, and in the summer of 1945, he goes to work for the U.S. War Department. He is debriefed, and in 1946, he's sent back to Germany. On the way back, he's given a medal by the Pope. He's inducted into the Order of the Sovereign and Military Order of Malta, the Knights of Malta, and he becomes the head of West German intelligence until the 1970s. And he recruits a host of former Gestapo officers and SS officers into West German intelligence agencies. He'll work as the head of West German intelligence until 1971. This guy serves Hitler, the CIA, and West Germany. Most notorious case is Klaus Barbie. Klaus Barbie is the head of the Gestapo in Lyon, France. There, he tortures numerous French victims, mostly resistance fighters, to death. He works out of the Hotel Terminus in Lyon, and he's most famous for hunting down these orphans, the children of Lisieux, this little village where Jewish orphans are hidden by their parents, have already been deported to gas chambers at Auschwitz, but a group of local French in this tiny village hide this group of Jewish orphans in an orphanage there, thinking that nobody will come to this remote village. Well, Klaus Barbie hunts them down and finds all these children and ensures that they're put to death. In fact, here's the order, 7th of April 1944, signed by Klaus Barbie, SS Obersturmbannführer. After the war, Barbie now is recruited by US intelligence. Barbie's job is to circulate among other escaping war criminals which become known as the rat lines, and to ensure that Soviet intelligence is not sending agents through the rat lines to back infiltrate through escaped war criminal underground Russian intelligence agents back into West Germany and into Germany. So essentially, Klaus Barbie is spying against his fellow war criminals, searching out communist agents among his war crime buddies. Barbie, of course, has a warrant out for him by the French. They want him, and so the French eventually get wind that Barbie's actually working for U.S. intelligence back in Germany, and ask the United States intelligence office, do you guys have Barbie? And this is the response they get. In accordance with your request, in 1950, I have investigated the matter of Klaus Barbie, failed to locate Barbie's whereabouts. I have just now been informed of rumors that Barbie has been seen in Munich. Well, indeed, the moment the French ask for Barbie, the Americans immediately exfiltrate him down the rat line to Bolivia, where he now goes into business in Bolivia, this hardcore killer. But just escaping justice is not enough for Klaus Barbie. Klaus Barbie now joins the Bolivian army as a special advisor. Here you can see his Bolivian army identification card. He's now going under the name of Klaus Altman Hansen. This card, you can see, expires in 1985. 40 years after the Second World War has ended, this guy is still a colonel, but this time in the Bolivian army. His job for the Bolivians, he is in charge of this paramilitary death squad called Los Novios de la Muerte, the fiancés of death. This group are enforcers for the Bolivian army. Their job is to kill any cocaine producers that are not paying a tax or bribes to the Bolivian armies. Los Novios de la Muerte go find these cocaine dealers and they murder them. So Barbie essentially now is in the cocaine traffic. The group is composed mostly of former SS officers and war criminals who are now hiding in Bolivia, Barbie's friends, and some young Germans like this guy, some young Germans like that guy there with a mustache. And these guys are eventually as well dispatched by the Bolivian army to hunt down Che Guevara in 1967, when Che Guevara is trying to raise a revolution in Bolivia. They'll actually fail. It'll be U.S. advisors that eventually will help the Bolivian army capture and kill Che Guevara. But Barbie is first assigned, since he's supposed to be such a great fighter of French partisans. They figure he'll be just as good finding Che Guevara and his guerrillas in the mountains of Bolivia. So Klaus Barbie, of course, in the early 1980s, what happens is, of course, there's a coup d'etat in Bolivia. The Bolivian generals no longer need Klaus Barbie, and the new Bolivian generals, and so now around 1984, shortly before this card is expired, suddenly the Bolivians now admit that, oh yes, indeed, Klaus Barbie is here. They arrest him and they hand him over to the French. They tell the French, come and get him. So 1985, finally, as I say, 40 years, the French finally come for Klaus Barbie and take him away after 40 years. Excuse me. He'll be brought back to Lyon and he'll be put on trial in the same prison where he had tortured and killed people during the war, and Klaus Barbie will find himself dying of cancer in a French prison where he belongs. The Los Novias de la Muerte, the fiancés of death, they continue functioning without Klaus Barbie. In particular, this young German, Joachim Fievelkorn, Fievelkorn, a paladin in the Kaufbund Deutschland Soldaten, the combat group of German soldiers, a kind of a Nazi revivalist neo-Nazi group in Bolivia. He ends up now traveling to Europe, where he is implicated in the right-wing terrorist bombing of the Bologna railway station in 1980. One of the, I think, the largest terrorist bombing in Italian history. I think 89 people are killed in the bombing of the Bologna railway station, and it's meant to be blamed on left-wing Red Brigade activists in the hope that there'll be a right-wing military coup in Italy in 1980. Of course, it fails, but Fievelkorn is accused of physically placing the bomb to detonate in that train station. Never proven sufficiently for him to go on trial. And so this is like a second generation Nazi. I mean, he certainly was too young to be in the, he must have been around maybe 10 years old during Nazi Germany, but he's kind of a second generation neo-Nazi brought up by a real Nazi of, Barbie's caliber, essentially. Today, this is what Fievelkorn looks like. He now lives in Spain. Here he is on his Facebook page. He and I are actually Facebook friends. And that's just how perverse history is. That a Gestapo officer's second generation right-hand man is now on Facebook. That's just how bizarre the world has become. And this is the kind of shit you'll find on Fievelkorn's Facebook page today. This is what they do in Spain. Some kind of neo-Nazi phalange group there. Some of the girls like to dress up in German nurse uniforms. So, a long life, longevity for the real killers, and I say generations of killers that essentially escape justice. I don't think that even 1% of the killers ever saw any justice. We're talking about several thousand prosecutions. There were plenty of death sentences. Most of them are commuted afterwards, especially as the Cold War begins. And the American position often is that these guys really, were good anti-communists. The best anti-communists there are ex-Nazis, and so you can see that if you go to the CIA website, you can look at the files that were opened up under the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act, and you can get them in this kind of form. Here you can see the act was introduced 2006. That's how recent this disclosure of documents had occurred. And so you can go through those files yourself and just see how these Nazis were being recruited and moved often through the Catholic Church. And again, there were just certain monasteries that were pro-Nazi monasteries, particularly Croatian Catholic monasteries. So again, it wasn't the Catholic Church as a total organization, but factions within the Catholic Church supported Nazis. Certainly, Eichmann had church documents that helped him to get to South America. Father Dragonovich is particularly notorious in the operation of the rat lines. You can hear some books on it. Annie Jacobson, Operation Paperclip. The Americans are also, of course, bringing in Nazi scientists for their nuclear weapons and missile programs and the space program. A lot of Nazi scientists who worked on the German rockets, the Foul-2 rockets, V2 rockets, of course, are going to work on building the American NASA space program and ICBM military missiles and so forth. A lot of new books based on the new CIA disclosures, Nazis on the Run by Gerald Steinacher. Useful Enemies by Richard Raschke. John Demaniuk and America's Open Door Policy for Nazi War Criminals. America's Nazi Secret by John Loftus. The Nazis Next Door, How America Became a Safe Haven for Hitler's Men by Eric Lichtblau. Blowback by Christopher Simon, American Recruitment of Nazis and Its Destructive Impact on Our Domestic and Foreign Policy. So, what are we to make of these killers in the end? The Genicksschussen Spezialisten, we know certainly that many of them were traumatized by what they were doing. Many of them were disgusted by what they were doing. They knew what they were doing was wrong. They were repelled by it, yet they went ahead and did it, the vast majority of them. What is the psychology? We can understand certainly the sadists. We can understand the anti-Semites. We can even understand the kind of officers who were ambitious and even though, as Eichmann said, I never had personally anything against the Jews, but I got orders to kill them and I did the best job for my bosses that I could. So we can almost understand that kind of bureaucratic ambition that we talked about, the bureaucratic consensus, the technocratic mentality of a bureaucrat wanting to solve a problem. Those things are understandable. We can understand young SS men, kids who perhaps might have been raised in the Nazi educational system to sincerely believe that the Jews are a threat to the German people and so forth. We can understand them, but how do we understand the doctors, the educated lawyers, the men in their 30s and 40s who were not educated as children in the Nazi system, but were educated in the Weimar system. And so, again, that book, Ordinary Men by Christopher Browning, talks about a kind of team spirit. I did the killing for my team. I did it for my brothers. And anybody who's played on a team knows the kind of loyalty you have to your team members to do your best to hold up your end as a team member. And of course, that applies to military service, police service as well. There's a reason that cops stick together, and soldiers are, as they say, a band of brothers, because your lives depend on each other in a way, as a soldier, and many will even sacrifice their life for a member of the team, let alone kill someone, even women and children. And so that's certainly the explanation that Browning gives for kind of the low end killers. There are, of course, other kinds of arguments. There is this idea that there are certain personalities that are more suggestive under an authoritarian regime. Theodor Adorno argues about a kind of testable authoritarian personality type. He says that there are individuals that kind of have a quote, rigid adherence to conventional values, submissiveness to authority figures, aggressiveness towards outgroups, opposition to introspection, reflection, and creativity, preoccupation with power and toughness, destructiveness and cynicism, projectivity, a kind of disposition to believe that dangerous conspiratorial things go on around them, an exaggerated concern with sexuality. All these things Theodore Adorno, a psychologist, sociologist, describes as the authoritarian personality type. And certainly the Nazis have all these characteristics, including this exaggerated concern with sexuality, with race relations. And of course, I think those kinds of personality descriptions that I just gave you describe a president just south of the border right now currently. Nonetheless, Adorno's theory that there's a certain personality type comes under criticism. John Steiner, another psychologist, suggests that the authoritarian personality type is a kind of a sleeper, that it's the environment and certain social conditions that sometimes unlock and wake up these kinds of sleepers, that they're among us, but they don't actually come out unless something environmentally occurs around them, so-called sleeper personalities. Yet another historian, Irvin Staub, kind of accepts Steiner's idea, but he actually believes that these so-called sleepers are actually a very common personality type. And he says essentially that evil that arises out of ordinary thinking and is committed by ordinary people is actually the norm, not the exception. Sorry. And so this idea that ordinary people are capable of the kind of murder that and the kind of murderous obedience that the Nazis had. And again, I don't want to call it obedience because clearly we know now from practices of certainly those police battalions that many of them, this was not the case with the Einsatzgruppe because they were specifically picked for that mission, but those police battalions that participated in those Einsatzgruppen killings, their commander offered anybody in that police battalion to step aside if they didn't want to kill women and children, and indeed 10% stepped aside, roughly. And so we have this series of experiments conducted by Stanley Milgram at Yale University in 1960, 1961, the so-called Milgram obedience studies. There were advertisements put in newspapers offering people work in psychology experiments that were testing memory and education. And it worked. Two people would be brought into a room. They'd be given a card that it appeared that they were choosing it at random as who was going to give questions, who was going to answer them to these various quizzes, but it was rigged. The person who was answering the questions, L, the learner, was actually an actor, and the person, T, the teacher, giving the questions was always a subject who was being experimented on without his realization. And the way it worked is E, you had a supervisor that would then tell the teacher every time the person gets a wrong answer, give them an electric shock. And every time push the next higher up button. And it was clearly indicated on this electric shock machine, which was a fake machine. L, the learner, was actually pretending and acting that he was getting electrical shocks. Every time the person answered the question wrong, they had to go up the scale to higher electric shocks. With the maximum votes, 450 votes, which were clearly marked on the apparatus as danger, severe shock. And so once this experiment begins, Milgram determined that 65% of all teachers, average Americans, responding to a newspaper ad for a paid for a fee if they participated in experiments were ready at the command of a supervisor. 65% were ready to punish the learners to the maximum 450 votes, and no teacher stopped before reaching 300 votes. There were variations. They tried different variations. For example, if the teacher could not hear the learner screaming or see them, they would go higher. If the supervisor wore a white coat, the teacher was willing to go higher on the scale of electric shocks. So the authority of the instructor was very important. The kind of supervisor instructor telling the teacher, don't worry, I take responsibility for anything you do. They would go ahead and give people these electric shocks, and peer pressure as well. If there were a number of teachers, and again they kind of planted actors, some would kind of say, oh, that's terrible, don't do this, don't push the next button. Peer pressure had a lot of to do whether the person would go ahead all the way to 450 votes or not. These are Americans in the 1960s and in the early 2000s. Again, unfortunately, I wish I had more time. ABC television kind of in the 2000s did a documentary reconstructing the Stanley Milgram experiments and saw that Americans today still will be ready to give these people, any people, strangers, shocks if they're told, even if that person is suffering and saying, oh, I have a heart condition, they will give those shocks if somebody in the white coat tells them, no, you can do it, I'll take responsibility for that. They'll do it. Because they think they're doing, as one guy says, well, I did what I was supposed to do. In other words, I was just following orders. So essentially, nothing has changed in human behavior. Peer pressure is very important. Again, when they substituted peers who encouraged the teacher to go ahead, they did it. When peers kind of discouraged them, fewer were willing to go high up the scale. So, all of us are educated to be obedient, to show up on time, to be respectful and obedient of our professors and then your employers, your clients. Obedience is kind of the watchword of civilization, and yet at the same time, this kind of blind obedience can take us into all sorts of dark corners, and anyone, including you sitting out there, I imagine are capable of being one of those sleepers, are capable of committing these kinds of atrocities under um, certain conditions, and I can't, not having been in that situation, I can't sit here and tell you that I would be not susceptible to stepping in that direction, nor can you unless you're faced with making that kind of momentous decision. And I hope none of you ever find yourself in that position, but if you do ever, I hope you recall the lessons that you've learned in this course with Nazi Germany. Wartime atrocities were not the exclusive domain of Nazi Germans. American troops fighting in the Pacific, when we talk about racial war, the war against, quote, the other, that's one aspect that many point out as well, that in a place like Russia, Poland, this was a race war as very much as it was in the Pacific. American soldiers in the Pacific collected skulls. They killed POWs. They threw POWs out of airplanes in the Second World War. They routinely shot POWs. As they did in Europe as well. A lot of, I have close contacts with the Canadian military. One of my books had to do with a seminal battle that Canada had fought. And I've spoken with World War II veterans who admitted to me that indeed they on occasion shot German POWs. Nothing that we did was as systematic as what the Nazis did. I don't want to say that we were as prevalent as the Nazis were, or that Allied British, American, Canadian troops were systematically murdering POWs, but it occurred. Here you can see American GIs cooking Japanese heads for skulls that they will bring back to the United States. And currently in the work I'm doing about serial homicide and its history, this is a huge problem right now for United States police, as all these souvenir skulls that American soldiers brought back to the United States are now turning up all over the United States as veterans have passed away and their children and grandchildren go up into the attic, and in the attic they find grandpa's war chest, and they open up the war chest, and there's all these Japanese flags and swords, and then skulls, many of them decorated. Often soldiers signed the skull, like everybody on your squad would sign the skull. So they have all these decorated skulls that they've kept in their locker in the attic since the war. And families, of course, are horrified. And so they take the skull and they throw it in a lake, or they dump it somewhere. Somebody finds it, and then police think that these are narco cult murders until forensic anthropologists look at the skulls and say, oh no, this is a wartime World War II skull. And so there are so many skulls now being recovered by authorities in the US. The US has actually developed a standard protocol of how they return these skulls now for a proper burial back to Japan. The British fighting in Malaya in the late 1940s, 1950s against Malayan guerrillas. The British are cutting off heads. So these Nazis, normal-looking Nazis, all of us are capable of that. Here you see American soldiers executing at Dachau some of the concentration camp guards that they found at Dachau. They were not taken as POWs. They were just right there by the troops, put up against the wall and shot. Not that they don't deserve it, but let's not be hypocrites as well at the same time and try to present ourselves as being completely free of war rages and war crimes. All of us are capable of it. Here you see as well, this is after the war. This is June of 1945. The war ended May 8th. Yet in June of 1945, Americans are executing a 17-year-old boy for spying behind American lines. I mean, for whom was he spying? The war is over. And it's published quite openly. Back then, the United States saw nothing kinky about executing a 17-year-old teenager who has been accused of spying, or executing German commandos. Those German, Hitler gave the commando order to kill British and American commandos. We're executing commandos as well. These guys were caught during the Battle of the Bulge. Their particular crime was they were operating in American uniforms, and that's a death sentence. And so these ordinary soldiers, they're special forces commandos, but they're shot by the Americans. And yet we regard Hitler's commando order as kind of a criminal order. Genocide continues in Cambodia. Millions of people murdered. In Timor, in Indonesia, in El Salvador, in Central America, genocides continue. Here is a genocide essentially of indigenous peoples that the El Salvadorians found inconvenient in terms of land distribution. So they just murder the indigenous population in Central America. This is recent. I mean, all this kind of ended only in the 1990s. These kinds of mass genocidal murders, class genocides, if you want to call them, again, indigenous peasant peoples in Guatemala, for example, as well. El Salvador, Nicaragua, prior to the Sandinista revolution there. These were all places where genocide was practiced routinely. The death squads. We're still digging up those bodies today. In Africa, around 1961-62, the island of Zanzibar. A black revolutionary government now decides it's going to ethnically cleanse the island of Zanzibar, which will become part of Tanzania, of all Arabs. And so all the Arabs are gathered up into this kind of concentrated area, and then they're massacred and hauled away by the truckload. This is the only footage we have of this. This is taken by an Italian documentary crew from a helicopter. This is the only images we have of the massacres in Zanzibar of the Arabs, buried in mass graves. Even the United Nations didn't identify this. Very few people know about the Zanzibar genocide. Rwanda in the mid-90s. The Balkans, Yugoslavia, with Croats, Serbs, Bosnians killing each other, killing each other's families and civilians over issues going back centuries in the past. This Yugoslavia, of course, was the return of genocide. It's in this Yugoslavian war in the 90s that the term ethnic cleansing is now coined. And this is the first time genocide returns to Europe. And they're all killing each other. No one, is innocent. Serbs killed Croats, Croats killed Serbs in this war. A pox in all their houses, as far as I'm concerned. But it was a bloodbath that essentially was kind of inspired as a payback for everything that had been done during World War II. And World War II, everything was done then was as payback for everything that was done, when the Ottoman Empire was in what is today Yugoslavia, what's left of it, and so forth. This is modern genocide, as I say, in Europe. United States. United States, of course, has practiced waterboarding, torture, since the war in the Philippines. Here you can see that's where waterboarding, in fact, was invented when the United States was suppressing the independent Filipino movement. Philippines, of course, was conquered by the United States from the Spanish. They took it from the Spanish and then began to suppress a Filipino anti-colonial movement and the rebellion in the Philippines, and waterboarding was the torture used there. It's used in Vietnam by American troops. So this is not something that was recently invented. And of course, the war that was conducted in Vietnam was a race war, essentially, against what Americans called gooks. This is the My Lai massacre, where American troops just went in and massacred women, children, babies, in the village of My Lai, notorious massacre in, I think it was in 1968, the massacre, but 1969, it's exposed. And of course, the war on terror, through which you kind of, many of you had come to age, the rendering of people into black camps, into kind of these um, gray zones where that don't fall even under the American Constitution. Those pictures of torture in the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Yeah, of course, there's an insurgency in Iraq. I wonder why. So it's not like we're learning from these kinds of courses, or at least certainly not, the American military in Iraq. How's this any less evil than what the Nazis are doing or did? The only difference is, of course, Trump now has completely sanctioned the International Court of Justice. That's something recent. I mean, the United States, even under Obama, already wasn't recognizing the International Court of Justice because they're afraid that American officers, American soldiers, are going to get dragged into a war crimes court. And so the United States doesn't recognize the International Court of Justice in The Hague. And Trump now, of course, has banned international court officials from entering the United States. But this is what they're doing. And then, of course, we have these photographs. Anybody out there tell me what they're looking at, what this particular case is? Anyone? This particular set of photographs of torture being undertaken? No one. How many people do I have online here? I got 43 people online. Not one of you know this case. Anybody can venture a guess, maybe? Come on, take a guess, somebody.
What are those bags behind? Is it bags of drugs?
No, those are sandbags.
Okay. So it's not Mexico. That would be my
No, it
guess.
isn't. Good guess, though. It looks like a Mexican narco torture, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does indeed. Anybody else? Can they identify who the soldier is? What country?
Is this in South America?
Is it South America? Good guess. That's the kind of torture they would do in South America, but no, it isn't. Anybody else? Come on. Well, guys, you're looking at Trooper Kyle Brown and Corporal Clayton Matchey of the Canadian Army in Somalia in the 1990s. This is what Canadian boys from Winnipeg are capable of doing. There's a good, both of them, Canadian Aboriginals in a paratrooper regiment deployed to Somalia in the 1990s. They capture a young boy who is stealing supplies from the Canadian Air Base. Shidane Arone is his name, and they proceed to torture him to death and take these photographs. This is what our army is capable of doing. Our good old Canadians are such polite, harmless people, but put us in a uniform and put us into a combat mission, Canadians are just as capable as a Nazi trooper with the same education that we all have, with all our sensitivities. We are just as capable of committing these kinds of atrocities. This is a terrific case, and that none of you were able to recognize it just shows you how much your memory, your cultural memory, is, for the lack of a better word, completely fucked up and erased from your knowledge. That you are not aware. You're like young German children, after the war, who don't realize what their elders were doing, like those doctors who go to med school and don't realize that their doctors were euthanasia killers, were killing babies. For I could be a genocidal murderer here. You wouldn't know, because your memory, you're completely washed of this kind of memory, and it's washed from our Canadian popular consciousness. We're not aware of this. This is not that long ago. I say this is the mid 1990s. Just Google Canada, Somalia, murder. You'll probably come up with the case of Trooper Kyle Brown and Corporal Clayton Matchey. They did go to trial. They were sentenced. One of them kind of attempted suicide and became kind of brain dead. I'm sure they're now out. They got relative low prison sentences, and they were released. And we ended up, of course, disbanding the entire paratrooper regiment. So, that bloody road that the Nazis took, there's a little bit of a bloody road for all of us, no matter what. There's a little bit of a Nazi in all of us, no matter what. Our Canadian education, our Canadian values, our Canadian kind of sense of dignity and equality means shit if you don't know your own past, if you don't know what you're capable of it. You're just essentially, as they say, whistling in the wind, if you don't know your own past. And that remains the essential problem right there and then, that we really do not understand what we're capable of. It. We are as capable, under the right circumstances, of killing as many people in the way that the Nazis did. We are just as equally capable of it. As I say, there's a little bit of a Nazi in all of us, and I urge you to root that Nazi out of you. And the best way to do it, of course, is be aware of where you live and what your history is, and the history of authority, essentially, because these crimes are committed under orders from authority. Very few people go out and commit these acts without there's some kind of social encouragement to do that, whether it's on Facebook or on YouTube or on Twitter, or by an idiot in the White House, or in our own parliaments, and so forth. We all kind of have to follow this delicate balance between conformity and obedience, and rebellion and disobedience. And it's a line that each one of you need to know when to cross, and where to cross. And you need to know what's hypocrisy as well, and you need to know what we are capable of doing before we start pointing our fingers at our neighbors, or at somebody across the sea, or somebody in the past as being monsters, not realizing what we ourselves are capable of. All right, guys, I think I'm done pouring all this horror at you that I've been pouring for the last 6 weeks. All the best of luck for you at the exam. Relax, enjoy. Most of you have been, as long as you follow instructions, most of you have been doing well. That's all you have to do is just read the instructions and follow them. That applied to your essay, to your midterm, as it does to the final exam. Follow the instructions to the letter, and you should do all right. Obviously, do the readings, review your notes, and all the best of luck for you in the exam and for whatever else you're pursuing through these courses. I regret that I was not able to meet you all in person, but all the best of luck to you.